My name is Mark Silverthorn, and I'm the social media director of the Ontario Model Soldiers Society. We have a special guest today. His name is Brendan Hogan. He is a member of the Ottawa Chapter of the Ontario Model Soldiers Society. Brendan is going to describe what took place at the Battle of Waterloo, the battle that ended Napoleon's career and forced him into his second and final exile. Brendan is then going to explain why Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon Bonaparte was the leader of France from 1799 to 1814, and then again briefly in 1815.
The Battle of Waterloo began when Napoleon fled from exile in Elba and arrived back in France on the 1st of March 1815. This precipitated the War of the Seventh Coalition, or more commonly known as the 100 Days Campaign. Napoleon, arrayed against all the forces of the other great powers of Europe, decided he needed to defeat the Anglo-Allied army in Belgium and the Prussian army advancing from the east before he had to battle the Russians and the Austrian armies and hopefully come to a peace arrangement that would saw his imperial reign survive. The Battle of Waterloo was ultimately fought on the 18th of June, 1815. It was preceded by the Battle of Quatre-Bras and Ligny on the 16th of June, 1815, in which both Napoleon engaged the British and the Prussian armies. Ultimately, however, both those armies were able to conduct an orderly withdrawal and set the conditions for the battle that would be fought on the hills of Mont Saint-Jean on the 18th of June. So the key commanders for this battle, for the Anglo-Allied army, it was the Duke of Wellington. He was born in 1769 in Dublin. He had served in the British Army in Holland, India, and most famously in the Peninsular War. Napoleon, also born incidentally the same year as the Duke of Wellington, 1769 in Corsica, had risen to prominence during the French Revolution, had become the first consul in November of 1799, and then coronated himself emperor in 1804. And the final commander is Field Marshal Blücher, who was the commander of the Prussian forces. The oldest of the three commanders, he was born in 1742 and had come to some prominence after his victory at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. So the exact time the Battle of Waterloo began is relatively unknown, sometime between 10 and 11:30 in the morning on the 18th of June. Shortly after that, Napoleon's guns began a huge bombardment on the Allied center. About approximately 150 Allied guns were overmatched by 250 of Napoleon's. This bombardment continued until approximately 1300 hours, when D'Erloin's First Corps began the assault on the center of the Anglo-Allied line in the vicinity of the Haisson, a key position, a fortified farm in the center of the Allied line. To counter the French infantry advance, the Earl of Uxbridge committed two of his brigades of heavy cavalry to charge the French. Two particularly famous episodes from the charge are the capture of the 105th Thing's Eagle by the Royal Dragoons and the capture of the 45th Thing's Eagle by the Scots Greys. And you can see Sergeant Ewart seizing the eagle. After the French infantry advance had failed and Napoleon had repelled the Allied cavalry charge, Ney, one of Napoleon's most famous commanders, decided to order a mass French cavalry charge. Unfortunately for the French, the attack was not supported with proper artillery and infantry support. The Anglo and Allied infantry were able to form into squares and repel the French advance. No British units lost their colors at the Battle of Waterloo. However, the French cavalry were able to seize two colors from the King's German Legion during the battle. After the cavalry charge, the French re-engaged in vicinity of La Haisson, again in the center of the Allied line. At this point, that key position fell to the French, and incidentally, the Prussians arrived on the eastern flank of the battlefield. Napoleon had to reorient some of his forces in order to repel the Prussian attack. At about 1830, with the capture of La Haisson and Napoleon being able to stabilize the position on his right flank with the Prussians, he then committed his last reserve to battle. The Imperial Guard, which had never been defeated before in battle, was committed to attack and break through the center of the Anglo line in order to be able to reorient and combat the Prussians. Napoleon didn't actually lead the attack, unlike my depiction with my toy soldiers, but he did commit them to battle, and it was the high water mark of the battle. The Anglo-Allied infantry tired and exhausted after a day of fighting, formed up again in their battle lines and were able to repel the Old Guard. Particularly the 52nd Light Infantry, commanded by Sir John Colborne, conducted a brilliant maneuver in which they moved around to the right of the French and engaged them, defeating them and repelling them. With Napoleon's last gamble defeated, Wellington signaled an advance of his army, which left the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean and advanced towards La Belle Alliance, where the Anglo-Allied army met up with the Prussian army. At this point, the British and Allied forces were completely exhausted, and the Prussians had to take up the pursuit as the French forces fled from the battlefield backwards towards Paris. Ultimately, the coalition was victorious, and Napoleon was exiled for good to St. Helena, where he remained until he died. The victory resulted in general peace for Eastern Europe that lasted until the Crimean War in the 1850s, and largely until the First World War in August 1914. In summary, though, the Duke of Wellington said, "Nothing except a battle lost could be half so melancholy as a battle won." There are several conflicting views on the reasons for Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. General Antoine Henri, Baron Jomini, one of the leading military writers on the Napoleonic art of war, attributed 4 reasons for Napoleon's defeat. Quote, "In my opinion, 4 principal causes led to this disaster. The first and most influential was the arrival, skillfully combined, of Blucher and the false movement that favored this arrival. The second was the admirable firmness of the British infantry, joined to the sang-froid and aplomb of its chief. The third was the horrible weather that had softened the ground and rendered the offensive movement so toilsome and retarded till 1 o'clock the attack that should have been made in the morning. The fourth was the inconceivable formation of the First Corps in masses very much too deep for the first grand attack." Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian soldier and military theorist who served in the Waterloo campaign and later author of On War, noted, "Bonaparte and the authors who support him have always attempted to portray the great catastrophes that befell him as a result of chance. They seek to make the readers believe that through this great wisdom and extraordinary energy, the whole project had already moved forward with the greatest confidence. The complete success was but a hair's breadth away, when treachery, accident, or even fate, as they sometimes called it, ruined everything. He and his supporters did not want to admit that huge mistakes, sheer recklessness, and above all, overreaching ambition that exceeded all realistic possibilities were the true causes." Unquote. Ultimately, I believe Napoleon's campaign planning, coordination of his forces, and all-arms cooperation on the battlefield at Waterloo were subpar compared to some of his earlier victories, like Austerlitz and Jena Auerstadt. Napoleon lost precious time delaying his assault that may have enabled him to defeat Wellington's army before Blucher arrived on Napoleon's right flank. Of course, whether Napoleon would have been able to exploit his success had he defeated Wellington with Blucher bearing down on his right flank is debatable, and ultimately, in my opinion, undone.